Before we start, I just wanted to let you know that you can become a paid subscriber of Lecker on Substack, Patreon, or Apple Podcasts. And you'll get access to exclusive content to hear and read. Subscriptions really help support Lecker. So if you're in a position to do that and you'd like to, head to leckerpodcast.com/support to find out more. Welcome to the Lecker Book Club. This month, Made in Taiwan by Clarissa Wei. In Made in Taiwan, Taipei-based journalist Clarissa Wei beautifully captures the food and spirit of this proud island nation and truly brings it to life on the page. The book is stunning. You'll hear more about the thought and consideration that Clarissa and her team put into how it looks, as well as what it says later in this interview. And it examines the current state of Taiwanese food in incredible breadth and depth. For me, someone completely new to the food of the country, it's a beautiful and rich education.
I wanted to give credit as much as possible to the people who gave me these recipes because, even though I do talk about myself a little bit in there, I really hope it's not centered around myself. I really wanted this to be a work of journalism.
It was such a pleasure to meet Clarissa via video chat and talk about this book, which involved an astonishing amount of research and recipe development. I'm a big fan of Clarissa's work as a journalist. The podcast series she made with Whetstone Radio Collective, Climate Cuisine, is one of my all-time favourite listens. And it was so interesting to hear how she approached this book, the subject of which is something hugely personal to her, but one which she wanted to approach journalistically and write as an act of documentation. We talked about how missing home through food sometimes takes unexpected, shifting forms, her culinary collaborator on the book, Ivy Chen, and why it was crucial that Made in Taiwan moved away from its original proposal as a quote-unquote cozy cookbook and became something deeply political. I began by asking Clarissa about how she first learned to cook.
I think the first time I had to really cook for myself was when I was in college. And I was in New York City, and I had grown up in Los Angeles in a very Asian part of Southern California where I was really used to Asian food. And, being in the middle of New York City, there's, Chinese takeout, but I sort of miss the flavors of home and home cooking. So I started off really simple, just getting noodles from the Asian market, maybe adding an egg, chicken broth, and would build from that. And then really, it was just adulthood, moving out on my own and starting to try different recipes. And now that I've been abroad for so long away from the States, I really miss, American food. So at home, we make a lot of chili, or we make a lot of tacos, or just things that we miss from home. But I know whenever I'm away from Asia, then I start missing, noodles or braised pork belly over rice. So, I'm not a trained professional cook, but it just comes really from necessity.
Yeah, I really liked the bit in the book where you talked about your Costco pilgrimage.
Yeah.
And that idea of going somewhere to stock up. Because I think I don't know, I feel like that conversation is maybe not always had. We often talk about people who live in, I guess, the West, cooking things that remind them of home. But I like the idea of flipping that on its head and you going to Costco for bagels. That was a really nice story.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And if you told me that I would be doing this, I would have laughed. But you really do miss the flavors that you can't get. I just miss having cheese so much, but I never ate it when I was living in California.
Yeah, that's so funny. Was it your immediate family that you were going to for recipes, or were there any sort of other cookbooks or people that you were turning to when you were first learning to cook as kind of a young adult?
No, I think when I first started cooking, it was also when I started my career as a food writer. So I got to meet a lot of chefs or a lot of home cooks and kind of see how they did it as well. I didn't necessarily turn to recipes. At home, I eat very, very simply. It's only for work when I will start measuring things and follow recipes and try all the techniques and stuff. But again, at home, we use the Instant Pot a lot. We do a lot of bulk meal planning. There's really nothing super extravagant or technical about the way I cook on a day-to-day basis.
And so is that why you collaborated with Ivy on this book, with Ivy Chen?
100%. Again, I'm not a professionally trained cook, but I know how to develop a recipe. And it was just really important for me to work with someone who has that experience, especially in the context of Taiwanese food. I'm sure I could have figured out a lot of these recipes myself by, Googling in Chinese, sort of reverse engineering things, but there's a million ways to make one dish, and I wanted it to be done right, and I wanted it to reflect how the people in Taiwan cook today. And Ivy was like kind of, how a lot of cookbook authors, they have like a mom or a grandma.
Yeah,
I don't have that. My mom is not an amazing cook. So Ivy was like my cooking mom. When we were doing the photo shoot, we all joked like she's like mama-san, or she's like the mother. And I learned so much from her, and this is what she does for work. And I'm so glad I made that investment and, signed her on, because this book would not have been what it was without her.
It's really great that kind of collaboration is so explicit as well, because I feel like that's something that a lot of cookbook authors do, but it's maybe just not acknowledged quite so kind of openly, like there is somebody behind the scenes doing the technical work, because it's like a really specific skill set, right? Like as a journalist or a food writer you might not have. So it's clear like her influence on it, and it's amazing.
Yeah, when I was in my early 20s, I was a little bit more hot-headed, and I would be very upset when I saw cookbooks of, writers who would go to a place and spend a week there, and then all of a sudden they're an expert. And I knew it's a whole book, and that's great. But I really knew that if I ever got the opportunity to do something like that, even though I'm Taiwanese, even though I live in Taiwan, I wanted to give credit as much as possible to the people who gave me these recipes, because this isn't, even though I do talk about myself a little bit in there, I really hope it's not centered around myself. I really wanted this to be a work of journalism, and for people to get to know the people of Taiwan. And with that, I wanted to give people credit, because it's so easy not to give people credit, because it's a completely different language and people here wouldn't have complained. But I did not want to be that person.
Yeah, no, I think that absolutely comes across like it is very much a work of journalism. I think the thing that struck me when I was reading it is just like the depth and breadth of the book. I mean, it's like an amazing, for someone like myself who doesn't necessarily know a lot about Taiwanese food, has never been to Taiwan, like it's an amazing kind of insight all in one go of the dishes and the history. And I don't think you are centered in it, but it's also, you're a way in for the reader, I guess, to, access these stories and like learn about your dad, like staying up all night to watch baseball with his friends and then have his mum make breakfast in the morning. Like those stories are kind of what brings it to life. Like I felt like you really brought the country to life on the page, which is like not a very easy thing to do. So it's clearly a huge project.
I appreciate that. And I also made an attempt to put people's like Chinese names with the Chinese characters there. Yeah. So many times, like I'm in a foreign country, or especially with a language that I don't know, and then you just Google that person's name and they obviously don't show up on Google, right? But if you Google their names in Chinese, then their information will come up. And then, if you're here in Taiwan and you really want to track some of these people down, you can do that yourself. And like, I'm surprised why that isn't the standard already. Is it laziness or?
Yeah, that's so true.
So I kind of wanted to sneak that in.
That does seem like such a simple thing. But I guess like I think there can be a real conservativeness around kind of cookbook writing, and like I think there's a real there's kind of been a small conversation in the UK recently about the idea of like italicizing words that aren't in English, and so I guess it's kind of like that's the same sort of thing, right? It's like you don't need to make something look foreign. Like it can just be part of the context as well,
right? And in a globalized society, anyone can like travel to Taiwan immediately too. So we're no longer so removed. So I think we should be pushing other food writers and food journalists to include as much information and like credit in the actual language as possible.
Yeah. Was it a tricky thing to navigate? Because you talk about Taiwan being a multilingual nation. Was that something that was hard to navigate when you were kind of interviewing people and then I guess, undertaking the process of translating their recipes? Was that kind of challenging?
It's multilingual in the sense that the language that people use at home might be different, but Mandarin is very much the dominant language. So knowing Mandarin, that was easy enough. If anything, it was like the Taiwanese dialects. Some older generations only speak Taiwanese. I understand Taiwanese, but I can't speak it. But again, because I had such a wonderful team and they were all born and raised here, I had help. I was not alone. Would not have been able to do that without them.
So you grew up in LA, went to college in New York. When did you move to Taiwan?
I kind of was going back and forth between the States and Asia since 2015. And then I got a full-time job in Hong Kong in 2018. And that was when I really settled in Asia. And my now husband, boyfriend at that time, was in Taiwan. So we were doing long distance. And then we settled here full-time in 2020. But when most people hear 2020, they're like, that's not a lot of time. You've only been there for 3 years. But not really. Like, I really spent a lot of time here since 2015. And before that, my parents would take me here every single year for winter vacation. So I've always had a strong connection to the island. And, you know, in 2020 decided, hey, I'm actually going to settle down here, start a family, and be here in Taiwan as a citizen and resident.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. I wanted to ask you, but I don't want to dwell on this too much because I do really want to kind of talk about what's in the book as well. But I think there can be a little bit of a kind of impression that cookbooks can be quite cozy. There's like almost a coziness or like an apoliticalness around cookbooks. And like from the outset, this is clear that it's very much not the case with your book. And even before it's been published, there's been quite a lot of very strong reactions to things that you've been posting online about it, which I'm assuming are from people who haven't read the book.
No,
which is, I guess,
it's not out yet. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess I just wanted to ask you whether you were braced for that sort of reaction to the book or whether it was a surprise.
Oh, I mean, I pitched it as much. The first round of pitching, it was more from that cozy angle that you were talking about. And that was in 2020, right when COVID was starting, and no one really got the urgency. I think some of the feedback was, I already have an author on my list who is of Taiwanese heritage. They weren't writing a book about Taiwan, but they were of Taiwanese heritage, conflict of interest. And then by 2021, a series of things had happened. The world started to know more about the pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong. B, there was a huge Stop Asian Hate movement in the United States. And then just this aware of coronavirus, more talk about Taiwan, China, and Hong Kong. And then I had revised my proposal to really embrace the urgency of the Taiwanese story as well, being like, hey, if we don't talk about this, it might actually be too late in a couple of years' time. And I immediately got matched with a publisher who understood that vision and that urgency. And I'm really glad that I got to tell this story, or that I was pushed to tell this story through this angle. Because, you know, while a cozy Taiwanese cookbook that you can curl up with by the fireplace would have been nice, we do live in a weird place. We are in a weird place here in Taiwan and are constantly dealing with existential threats, even though most people might not talk about it on a day-to-day basis. And food and politics it's undeniably intertwined here, even though a lot of people and a lot of my critics say, why do you have to push them together? But you can't divorce them. So it was just a series of fortunate events and good timing that led to this book being sold and published.
Yeah. I think in this case, I don't want to sound like I mean cozy as like a negative thing, but I do also think the book is there's so much beautiful storytelling in it, as well as that kind of it is all part of the story. So I think you could absolutely curl up with it, even though obviously some of the content is very serious and, like you say, very urgent. How would you describe this book to somebody that hasn't read it?
This book is a reflection of modern Taiwanese food as it is in Taiwan today. It includes a lot of history and context that you would not get anywhere else. And what makes this book different from any other cookbook about Taiwanese food is it's the first time where there is a clear distinction of Taiwanese food as its own entity and not under the umbrella of Chinese cuisine. So I hope for it to be a comprehensive overview of Taiwanese food for people, but also a disclaimer that food is very personal and that it will differ by family and where you are in the world. But we try to be as comprehensive as we could have been in the time and space constraints that we were given.
Is that something that you're also expecting people to react to, that they think that you've written down recipes in a way that isn't, you know, kind of relevant to their family's account of it?
Yeah, especially there's all this like gatekeeping and what authenticity is, or why didn't you include this recipe or that recipe? And sure, that you can go on and on. But again, that's why I tried to divide things by periods, you know, different historical periods, and list down. Like, I really sort of proved my work. So I anticipated all the critiques because I've been writing about food and Asian food for, you know, over a decade. So a lot of these critiques I've gotten before, and I just sort of anticipated them and built them in the book. So before people can say anything, it's there already. But as you've seen, this is such a heated topic. It triggers a lot of people. And I know no matter what, I'm going to get hate for it. But that's fine. That's just a function of being Taiwanese these days.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of sad that that's just like the accepted position that you have. But I guess there's an inevitability about that.
Yeah, I mean, if anything, it's more motivating and it just goes to show how important these stories are if it creates so much hate and controversy.
Could you tell me about some of the kind of people who feature in the book? Could you tell me about some of their stories and how you came to meet them and include their recipes in the book?
Yeah, so going into this, I wanted a very diverse group of people, not just, you know, people whose families came here after 1949, which is kind of the dominant perspective in Taiwanese food in English media. And so with that, I sort of tapped into my reporting. You know, while I was writing this cookbook, this was when a lot of things were happening in the political space in Taiwan, and I was shooting documentaries about cross-strait tensions and like warplanes coming over. And so through these assignments, I got to know a lot of people. And while I was there, I was like, hey, give me your recipe or tell me about your family's recipe. And then I had a Rolodex of people I could cycle through, but also through my past reporting. So it was me tapping into, you know, the people I was interviewing who were aware of tensions, but also past reporting. And also being very conscious of, I don't just want one perspective. I want people from all walks of life. So we have young people and older people, and from whose families came from different immigration patterns. I was really lucky to have a researcher. I brought on a researcher who helped me, you know, get organized and talk to all of these people. And even if people did not give me their recipe per se, I wanted their perspective in it. And there are a couple recipes like that. So like example, the ice cream burrito in the dessert section, that's not their recipe, but I did interview them and sort of got some context. And with space constraints, I wasn't able to do that for every single dish, but as much as possible, I wanted to talk to a vendor or a chef on the ground and just get a little soundbite in of their voice and what this dish means to them and what makes it special.
I love the kind of context you gave around, I've forgotten their name, but the indigenous Taiwanese person that you said you lived with for a month. Could you just tell me a little bit about them and like kind of what it was like learning about that, I guess, aspect of Taiwanese history?
So I think a lot of people have heard of the WIF program, the Worldwide Organization of, I don't even know what the acronym is. It's a program where you can sign up and then live on a farm and work with someone. So Alice had put a listing up, and she doesn't necessarily have a farm. The jungle is her farm, but she has a restaurant. And this was in a period of my time where I was just kind of single and restless and did not know what to do. And I thought, hey, going to live with this woman for a month sounds really fun. And what we did is every morning we would go out in the jungle in the back of her, you know, with her pickup truck and just pick some vegetables. She never called it foraging. It was just like, let's just get some ingredients for the restaurant. And then we would work at her restaurant, and then we would go home and she would tell me stories of her upbringing. Her mom was the last shaman of the tribe. Her dad remembers, you know, he actually just passed away at like the age of 100 or something crazy, but he remembers like running in between tribes with like a torch, like barefoot, to deliver messages, which is so surreal. It's like from a different time. And I kind of just became this recorder when I was there and just try to document everything and remember everything. So I knew when I got this book, I wanted to dedicate a subchapter to her stories. But she's so inspirational, and there's so many people in Taiwan like her.
And so the recipes that you included in that kind of that subchapter, were they ones that you remember making with her in the restaurant?
Yeah, those are recipes that she made. So like the sausage, it's with betel nut leaf, which is an ingredient that she keeps on pushing. And so that's the thing with the indigenous people here. They're not necessarily pushing ingredients that are indigenous to Taiwan because there's no market for that, but it's also ingredients that just grow really well here or were introduced before. So like the betel nut leaf, that's really prominent in like Vietnamese cuisine or Thai cuisine. But here in Taiwan, people don't eat it. There's like a stigma around it because it's wrapped around the betel nut, and that's kind of a psychoactive ingredient that gets people high. But it's really nutritious and it grows wild, but people don't eat it. And so Alice has been on this campaign to promote it. So she like puts it in her sausage. Same with the pigeon pea. I have a recipe for pigeon pea stew that was actually introduced in the Japanese colonial era. And it's such a great ingredient when you're growing it on the farm because it helps enrich the soil. But the majority of Taiwanese people don't cook with it. It's used a lot in India and other parts of Asia. So I think just including that perspective and how Taiwanese food can be very different depending on who you're talking to was quite important to me.
So I wanted to say to you that I absolutely loved the series that you made with Whetstone, Climate Cuisine. It's like one of my favourite ever podcasts. I think
that's
amazing.
Really sweet.
It was so great. Like it gave me such like a new perspective on, because, you know, in the UK, like we're very much, for a long time, like for a long period of our history, we have imported like such a high percentage of what we eat. Like we're a nation of imports, like for various reasons. So it's kind of really interesting to think about, I think, from that perspective as well. Like, because we have sort of a very weird understanding of like what our native food even is at this point, because we've taken so many aspects from different people and different types of cooking, etc., etc. But I guess I wanted to ask you whether there was any sort of tension with writing a recipe book where you're like, you know, specific ingredients are quite important because you want the recipes to be true to kind of the stories of Taiwan. But then, you know, this work that you've done, I guess, around like climate and the, you know, the kind of bad aspects of the global food system. Was there any kind of tension there for you?
Yeah, I mean, I see this more as a work where I am documenting what people eat here.
Sure.
And so I didn't really, and there's like not a lot of vegetarian recipes at all. It's very meat heavy.
Really?
So the diet here is not sustainable, if you will. Okay. But you know, I did think about like supply chain because a lot of these like specialty ingredients are imported in, but it was important. The goal of this book was to capture a snapshot of what Taiwanese food is now, because that might change later. And you even see it in how people are cooking. People aren't using these like ingredients that are very expensive or hard to get. They're taking shortcuts, which is probably more sustainable and better. There's this ingredient called an olive flounder. It's a dried flatfish, and that forms the basis of a lot of the broth, but people don't really use it anymore. They'll just use like instant bouillon cubes or like fish cubes or kelp. But again, I approach this project very much just, I want to document this before it goes away, and how people choose to interpret that and tweak that into their own cooking. That's completely up to them. My goal was, again, to just, here's a snapshot.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, actually. And I think, I don't always view recipe books that way, and I think it makes a lot of sense to see it like that way. It's not just a kind of instruction manual. It is a documentation. So yeah, that's really interesting. Are there any recipes in the book that are particularly meaningful to you? I'm aware that, it's a huge book, there's so many recipes, but are there any that kind of really stand out for you?
The one that I always tell people, and that I'm actually making right now in my Instant Pot, is the braised pork belly over rice. Just because it's so simple, but with the Taiwanese diaspora, there's a tendency to overcomplicate it. I think a lot of people put in like a million spices and then they braise it to death and they'll add like all of these things. And when I was interviewing the vendor who makes it, he only puts 4 ingredients: water, sugar, soy sauce, and shallots. I added a little bit more because his secret is using like the leftover braising liquid that they've been using for 3 generations.
Sure.
So I added a little like rice wine and garlic for complexity. So what really stood out is like how simple a lot of these flavor profiles are and not to overcomplicate things. And with Taiwanese food, what I realize is chefs exercise a lot of restraint in terms of seasoning. And that was something I really struggled with because I'm American and we tend to oversalt things. And when I brought on a bunch of recipe testers as volunteers, a lot of the feedback was everything could use a couple grains of salt. But then Ivy's like, but we don't eat like that here in Taiwan. Like, everything is very not salty. And I kind of had to be the middle ground where I was like, okay, let's maybe add a little bit of salt, but not too much. Basically, that was a huge lesson for me, that Taiwanese food is very minimal, focused on just the original flavor of the ingredient. So if you source like a really beautiful pork belly, you won't need that extra soy sauce or salt or all those spices. And it was a really enlightening lesson for me.
Yeah, totally. But so that's interesting that you say that things are kind of like seasoned sparingly, but you also talk about kind of the complicated relationship Taiwan has with sugar.
Oh yeah, people... So like things are seasoned sparingly, but with a lot of sugar, which again is like, for someone who grew up in the West, it's very confusing at times. And things have just gotten sweeter and sweeter. But again, like that was kind of an internal conflict I had as someone writing a cookbook. It's like, how true do I want to be to like the flavors here? And again, I just went back to, people can read this recipe, taste, like I really encourage people to just use their taste buds. If it's too sweet, don't put that much sugar. If it's not salty enough, add more salt. But these flavors were guided by Ivy's flavor profile, who has been here for so long, and I wanted to keep it like that.
Why do you think there is such like a leaning towards sweetness, I guess? I think that's probably a hard question to answer, but I find it really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, most of it is historical. When we were colonized by the Japanese, Taiwan was the only place where they could have sugarcane plantations. So it just became a really huge part of our economy. I think it was like 2/3 of the population, they were sugarcane farmers. So it just became associated with wealth and progress. Yeah, like you can buy all of these different types of sugar in the store, but I can't find coarse sea salt anywhere. I just find like fine sea salt. It's really fascinating what people prioritize here.
Yeah, because there's a few sort of, I guess, similar examples where a colonial power or a global power has brought an ingredient or popularized an ingredient. Because the story of kind of all American wheat was super interesting as well. So the US bringing over, they exported wheat, but then it was a whole promotional campaign. I'm sort of forgetting.
Yeah, so with the wheat, it's the US had this program, and it wasn't just with Taiwan. It was in the Cold War. They wanted to win over the favor of a lot of countries and bring them away from communism. So Taiwan just got billions of dollars of aid, but we also just got a surplus of wheat because the U.S. had produced a lot, and it was a way to get Taiwan to be pro-US versus being more sympathetic towards, say, communist causes. And even to today, most of our wheat is American. And that was something I was really confused about when I was recipe developing, because when I first started, I was like, this recipe is not working with my American brand of flour. And why isn't it working? And then when you Google it online, actually, most sources say it's because Chinese wheat has a lower protein content. And something about that did not sit right with me, because I was like, we don't have Chinese wheat. Like, we don't communicate with China like that. Where is this coming from? Yeah. So I like messaged so many food bloggers and bakers, and eventually got a hold of this guy who has a Chinese blog called like Brian Cuisine, and he teaches Taiwanese people how to make Western sourdough breads and like baguettes and stuff. Way. Yeah. And he was like, oh yeah, I mean, you're completely right. The protein level of wheat in Taiwan and in America is exactly the same. The difference is how they mill it and the additives that they use. And so the water ratio will differ a little bit. But yeah, there was a point where like Ivy and I had packets of like American flour and Taiwanese flour, and we were looking at the protein content, and it was the exact same. And I like could not figure it out. So there's a lot of misinformation about like where our ingredients come from or the origins of it. And this project really helped me debunk a lot of these myths.
Yeah, and that's something that's so hard to unpick, right? Because unless you can find someone who knows, like, you can't go into a mill and like know exactly what they're doing. And yeah, it's so complicated. Again, I guess it's that like global supply chain thing, but yeah, it's all very opaque.
And even to this day, if you tell me like how to change the water ratio, I'm like, I'm not really sure. Our solution was my parents just brought bags of American wheat for me, and then Ivy and I just tested it from scratch. It's not like I have a conversion formula in my brain.
Right. Yeah, that's so funny. I loved how you talked about Taiwanese kitchens, and you said they were either charming or janky, depending on your perspective. Yeah. Can you tell me about the main things that characterize Taiwanese kitchens for you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm moving now because it's actually a little bit inconvenient when you're a cookbook author. But sure. I live on a 6th floor walk up, and I have a gas tank that I have to call someone, and they bring over a gas tank, a propane tank to connect to my stove every time we run out of gas. There's no hot water in the kitchen. We don't have a dishwasher. Wow. All kitchens don't come with ovens, so we use a toaster oven. It's really, really hot in there. There's no air conditioning. It is very, very minimalistic, and we just made do. But again, the beauty of Taiwanese food is you don't have all of these fancy gadgets. All you need is a stove and a wok. And what was really kind of difficult for me to first adjust to is the fire here when you turn on the stove is like a rocket fuel engine. And that like really affected the recipes too, because something that would take, 2 minutes, like 10 minutes in the States would take 2 minutes here. I would burn things easily here, and just sort of figuring out the nuances between the Western kitchen and the Taiwanese kitchen was very difficult for me. But I am moving soon, and hopefully we'll have a better setup. But if anything, it just taught me that you don't need a lot to cook a great meal.
Yeah, totally. I really enjoyed the little anecdote about going to a store and talking to someone about maybe replacing your Taiwanese stove with an American one, and kind of being met with shock horror.
He was because so offended. Yeah, he was just like, do you want food with no flavor? Like, the high flame is what gives our food flavor. And fair enough, but it's really difficult to time things. And that's a cultural thing too. In the West, when we get recipes, we really want precision, timing, exact measurements. And like here in Taiwan, like people do not think like that. It's very intuitive.
And that must be that's like a process of translation when you're writing a cookbook, right? Because people kind of have this expectation of, especially if it's something they haven't cooked before or even eaten before, maybe they just need to know what to look for, I guess.
Yeah. And then even with Ivy, like she didn't understand why I wanted everything to the teaspoon or to the gram. And eventually she adjusted, and like we would like poke fun of each other because of it. But, she's a fast learner, and eventually we got the hang of things. But I do think it is important to measure things and time things, especially when you are writing a cookbook, because this is the only way you can transmit recipes across cultures and across borders. And I think people sort of make fun of maybe me or us for being so finicky with our little spoons. But it is an act, again, of preservation, and how better else to do it than to approach it more scientifically and get the measurements and the timing down to a T.
Yeah, totally. You know, you talked about, you eat quite simply at home, you cook quite simply. Has the process of developing these recipes in the book, has it changed how you cook at home? Are there things now that maybe you didn't cook before, but you would now?
No, if anything, I just don't really want to eat Taiwanese food all that much anymore because there's just so much oversaturation of Taiwanese food, and it's made me appreciate Western food even more. And then if you go through the recipes, a lot of them are technically quite difficult, which is something that I learned through this process. You know, some of these street food dishes, you look at it and it's like, oh, that should be easy, but there's a lot of prep involved and a lot of finicky things and a lot of technique that we don't use in the West. And so for every recipe, it wasn't like I could prep it beforehand. A lot of it I had to do the day of, and it was exhausting. And that's kind of made me value like the art of bulk meal planning and cooking in bulk and simple, quick 15-minute recipes, which this book is not. This book does not. I mean, there's like the beer food section, right? Or a family style where you can quickly stir fry things, but most things are very intensive and take a lot of time, and it just made me appreciate the other side.
yeah, that's so true. I think it's hard, isn't it? Because obviously you want people to be able to try things maybe if they don't have the opportunity to go to the country themselves, but then even something like the fried dough sticks, the kind of breakfast dough sticks, I can't remember the name in the book, but that is, you know, there's such like an elaborate process to kind of like shaping them. And if you're doing that, like somebody who's done that their whole life can probably do it in a second.
Exactly.
But it's really hard to translate that.
And if anything, I hope people can read this book and come away feeling that there should be more value assigned to Asian food than it is currently in the West. You know, there's this stereotype that Asian food is cheap, takeout, unhealthy, but it is very ingredient time intensive, and it really makes me complex. It's so complex, and it really makes me appreciate the vendors, and learning how complex these things were made me want to write it down even more, because this stuff does not exist in English. Something that's fun for a lot of people is I included just photography notes throughout the book. My food stylists were really good at putting in Easter eggs throughout. We worked with museums who donated or lent us their pieces. And so if you flip through the book and you look at the photography notes, you'll notice little tidbits, and I'll say, you know, this plate came from this era and why they used this utensil. And I hope it's not just informative in the text, but the photos can tell you a little bit more about Taiwan as well. So that's the fun thing that we baked into the book that most people won't be aware of until they get their physical copy.
Yeah, that's so cool. And there was kind of personal aspects to that as well. Like they kind of acknowledged when the stylist had brought a table from like their family or something. And it was really cool. Again, that's something I think you don't see very much. Like the pictures are often just sort of a set for the food. So it's really nice to get that extra bit of context. And that's amazing that you had museum pieces. That's so cool.
My stylist and photographer, they approach every dish like a scene, and every chapter like a small little movie film, if you will. So if you actually look through each chapter, every chapter has a different light setting. So the night market one is like very warm. So you'll see all the pictures are very warm. The family style is more bright pastel colors. And so they had their foundation, and then they had their props that they would put in. And so I would say like 90% of these dishes, these props aren't just like random things they found. It's like they use this pot because this is how the plate that we would eat with at home, or this is what you would see at the night market. It's very purposeful. It's very scenic. And I did not ask them to do that. They just did that by themselves.
You just had a great team.
I just had an amazing team. And it's incredible that they did that. And I learned so much from the process.
Yeah, that's so cool. I'm going to go right back through the book now and like look at
just look at the lighting. The
lighting.
lighting is so, and then every corner too. I think each photograph would take like up to 2 hours, and because she was looking at like the corners of each picture to make sure it was perfect. So just the framing was very purposeful.
I think that's why it feels like I use the word comprehensive, and I think you never want to claim something is definitive, but I think comprehensive is a very accurate term to describe this book. And it's not only comprehensive, but it is beautiful. Like, it's such a beautiful book. And having that level of detail in it, I think, is what gives it that like amazing texture, as well as like your writing. So yeah, it's honestly like, it's a fantastic book. So congratulations.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And thank you for reading it and flipping through it too. I appreciate that.
Lecker is hosted and produced by me, Lucy Dearlove. Thanks to my guest on the Lecker Book Club this month, Clarissa Wei. Made in Taiwan is out now, published by Simon & Schuster. As part of the monthly Lecker Book Club, I will be writing on the book over on the Lecker Substack and Patreon. Have you been cooking from it? Have you been reading it? Have you noticed the light settings? Come and chat about that or your favourite recipes in the comments, or tag me on Instagram when you read it or post dishes. I'd love to see them. Music is by Blue Dot Sessions. Before I go, one more reminder that you can also sign up as a paid subscriber to support Lecker on Apple Podcasts, Patreon, and also now on Substack. Links are in the show notes. And to any paid subscribers who are listening here, thank you so much for your continued support. The new subscriber-only series begins this week. It's been slightly delayed as I was finishing Good Bread, so thanks to all subscribers for their patience. This new one is going to be a bit of a meandering look at something that occupies a large space in my brain at all times, and that is food packaging. The series is called Out of the Box, and here's a little clip of what you can expect from some of these episodes. Here is Shohini Banerjee, aka Smoke and Lime, who is going to be talking about the condiments she makes and the cooking she does and how it's packaged and approached. Thanks for listening.
For me, actually, it goes back to, and I'd love to mention this, there's a concept of this, it's like a corner shop in Kolkata where I come from. It is, they're called Mudir Dokan. So Dokan means shop, and Mudi means a person who provides like necessities. So these shops, they're in every single neighborhood, minimum like 15 steps from your house or something. There's so many of them, and they stock all your necessities, but they kind of give it to you in your containers or plates or bowls or whatever. So you can go and ask for lentils or rice, and there's a person who sits at the front of the shop, everything's behind them, and you ask them for what you need. And it is a basics shop, so you can't get fancy things. But you can get, you know, like your eggs, your rice, your lentils, your beans, maybe butter, oils, and like some snacks, and that's about it. But they don't have any packaging. There's no branding on anything. And they're the old school shops in Kolkata, where I come from. Actually, a lot of India as well. And they're kind of dying out at the moment because of supermarkets.